we are discussing leadership styles at the place of work, and so far we have discussed the behavioral theories of leadership. We have talked about that how a leader can create conditions of work for their subordinates. So, we have discussed earlier the schools of thought which relate to the behavioral school of thought, and we have also discussed the participative theories and some of the recent theories. In today's lecture, we are going to discuss further on the understanding of leadership after having debated that what are the newer issues and why is it very difficult to analyze leadership and what is the meaning of a situational leadership. Today we are discussing the leadership styles which I wish to include in today's discussion is that we also talk about transactional and transformational leadership style, because a leader's role is also of transaction and transformation. And when we are talking about transactional leadership style, basic idea is that the leader tries to transact and give feedback to the subordinates, and obviously as we all understand, to achieve the goals in an organization. Goals, that means the work performance in an organization. And one of the special type of leadership style that we are going to talk about here today is the charismatic leadership style, and then we move on to the ethical leadership style. So, in fact, the transactional and transformational leadership styles, the special case of transformational leadership style is perhaps also is that you can see in a charismatic leadership style. So, let us move on to understand that how the charismatic leadership style is working. When we are talking about the charismatic leadership, in fact, here I have listed the charismatic and transformational leadership style, and then the whatever I have said now, the ethical leadership style. Now, when we are talking, let us first take up the ethical leadership style. The ethical leadership style, as we understand, that is the leader who is practicing morality as also as an attribute of leadership style. So, the true leadership is assessing the followers' needs and expectations and inspires them to realize a vision that best serves the followers and the organization. In ethical leadership style, we are talking about, so we have understood that leadership is a situation where you have the leader and the follower, and the main objective of a good leadership style in a work organization is task performance. Okay? And of course, in the long term, the satisfaction and the techniques that we use could be participation. Okay? So, here what we are talking about, that are the moral principles important also for leaders. Okay. So, here then we move on to understand that what other authorities have talked about leadership style, and here I wish to quote Professor Kanungo. In fact, Professor Kanungo had been my professor also, and he taught me in terms of many things, including the leadership styles, and he has written a lot on leadership styles. And in fact, I also attended recently an international conference where he was giving a keynote address on the ethical leadership styles. So, some of the excerpts from that, Professor Kanungo has said that it is the leader's moral principles and integrity that gives legitimacy and credibility to the vision and it sustains it. I was discussing the ethical leadership styles, and the reference to that, as I said, is from an invited lecture of Professor R. N. Kanungo of the McGill University, who also was my professor, and the paper is on preparing for ethical leadership in organizations. And from that, some of the excerpts that we are discussing today, and let us see what Professor Kanungo and his colleagues, they have worked for many number of years on different styles of leadership, and they have written a lot on ethical leadership. So, the ethical leadership discusses about morality of a manager. When the leader's moral integrity is in doubt, then the leader's vision, however noble, well crafted and articulated, is viewed by others, with a skeptic mind, and it loses its vigor and is incapable of moving them to work towards realization. So, that means the ethical principle in general, which is important in general, as our citizenship behavior in organization or generally in life, is extremely important for a leader as well. And in the recent years, we have been emphasizing on this point, that if a leader has to become a very effective leader, then he has to be ethical in his practices, and this is what is emphasized here. And I should say that some of these are the recent additions to our understanding of the leadership styles in organizations. So, the issue here is, do we really need leadership, ethical leadership in organizations? Do we need really? What is your response? Perhaps many of you will say yes, even though its practicing may be different and difficult in fact. Here something I would also like to add, from Professor Kanungo's paper. Here they have put that question, do organizations need ethical leadership? To answer that question, examples which are given in his paper are about the Enron Corporation filed for the largest bankruptcy in the United States history, leaving thousands of employees jobless. So, according to them, this is one of the ethical issues of leadership, and that he has quoted. Also, there are a number of examples that he has given, but also he has talked about some other, for example, a study of AACSB Business School. That's, I guess, that's again in Canada. The study of these deans, this found that the deans are more likely to participate in unethical actions if they result in substantial donation in their schools. This is another example. In fact, this is based on a study by Signo, Rockness, Hunt and Ho in 1998. So, this is what is quoted in his paper. Just by giving reading these examples from his paper, what I am trying to say, that in the recent years we have been trying to look into this human aspect very seriously as part of the leadership practice as well. In general, of course, we will be discussing the values and ethics in organizations as our separate lecture, separate discussion. But also we can't really say that that discussion is separate from the ethical leadership that we are discussing here. So, do organizations need ethical leadership? Professor Kanungo has given number of examples to us, and then based on that we can start observing that where are we going unethical. Then the next issue that he has talked about is on what dimensions a leader should be judged to be ethical or unethical. There are number of dimensions on which the leader can be judged as ethical or non-ethical. Basically, the social requirement and the social standards, the values will make him ethical and non-ethical. Then the issue comes up, what are the moral foundations of leadership influence process? The human values are important in this regard. See, if you have your values, then you are going to practice that also as a leader. So, the human values are very important, and that is why when we are trying to make some management development program or the program like what you are undergoing now, we emphasize that the value training is very, very important, okay, because that is there as your mindset, and once you are value laden, your practice also will reflect that. And then how can we operate for the ethical leadership? So, what should we do? We have to practice the ethical standards, the values which are embedded in our thinking. Therefore, lot of thinking and rethinking is involved. Moment you become a manager, and moment you are claiming that you have done a course in management, you have to really be ethical leader. Lots has been written about the ethical leadership in the recent years. In this connection, we also discuss some of the leadership strategies. Here, I have tried to note a couple of them. Warren Bennis, for example, and of course, Nannes, for example, they have studied 90 leaders in business, government, arts and sports, and they have tried to also support the point of view that the ethical leadership is important. Managers are the people who do things right, and the leaders are the people who do right things. This is a quotation, and you can make that difference in terms of your understanding of ethical leadership style. Okay, I repeat, managers are people who do things right. Manager is supposed to manage and do things right. Okay, and leaders are people who do right things. Okay, that means according to certain guidelines, managers are achieving those procedures, rules, and trying to achieve results. Do things right. Okay, but when they do right things, that means some kind of a decision is also involved, some kind of a discretion is also involved there. Okay. So, in achieving those results, you also see if is there anything that is unethical, and perhaps if you are a participative manager, then you will bring that as your participative management strategy and discuss with people to achieve results. Therefore, becoming ethical becomes very important. Before I take up some of the other issues, let me also quickly tell you that the leadership styles that we are talking about are also put under the category of transactional and transformational leaders. Transactional and transformational leaders. And the issue of ethical leadership will come under the transformational leadership, some kind of a we can say variant of that. Okay. So, the broad categories are the transactional and transformational leaders, and as you can see that a participative management is a transactional leader, as well as he could be very ethical and he could also be a transformational leader. This brings us to some of the recent theories of leadership. Ethical theory of leadership, of course, ethical style is also one of the recent ones, but in addition to that, we also have the leadership style in the recent years what we are talking about as empowering leadership style. Empowering leadership style perhaps will be some I will just talk to you briefly about empowering leadership style, and out here in IIT we have also done some research work on empowering leadership style of Indian managers. Now, the empowering leadership style basically as you can also translate that this is a leader who is empowering the subordinates in the process of decision making. Okay. So, the empowering leadership style which a manager can really inculcate will talk about expressing confidence in the subordinates, accompanied by of course the high performance, fostering opportunities to participate in decision making, we are talking about empowering leadership style, some of the newer areas and newer theories, where we find that the concept of participative management is reflected at every stage, at every step. So, from fostering opportunities, we move on to our understanding of empowering leadership style in terms of setting inspirational and meaningful goals, and also providing opportunities at the place of work in terms of encouragement, feedback and social interaction. So, as a manager, we have begun our discussion with the autocratic manager, if you would recollect. Then we have talked about that autocracy and democracy, that is a continuum, and participation comes in between, maybe closer to democracy at the place of work, but somewhere in between. But further we have discussed that the explanation of leadership theory goes much beyond that now, there are so many different explanations coming up, and in fact all are interwoven, all are interwoven. So, when we are talking about the empowering leadership style, we are talking about creating a climate, work climate, which is highly motivating by the manager. So, on the one hand, manager has, we also call that as the attribution theory, where we are attributing the success of manager's performance to his intelligence, some of his traits, as we have discussed earlier in this course, that the earlier theories were also talking about that great men are born great, that kind of a concept. So, so we try to understand that the characteristics of a leader perhaps will be highly sort of aggressive, intelligent, and something like that. So, number of other personality traits, but we have realized that in the recent years that in addition to leader's traits, we have to consider subordinates or the followers as important component. In our situational leadership theories that we have discussed earlier, we have found that the situation becomes very, very important. That is why we find that in the recent years we have been talking about the charismatic leader, the ethical leader, and the empowering leader, who are the transactional and transformational leaders. So, lot of recent literature has been written on this. Now, we move on to the leadership style and the components of leadership style in terms of the overall what the leader should do, and this in this process what we find that leader's vision is very important. When you become a manager, and as we have seen earlier that you will become a manager, but in order to become a successful manager you should also be a good leader. As a good leader or a successful manager, you should have a vision, you should have good communication, develop vision, good communication. We have seen earlier that what is the meaning of communication? Create a climate of trust, because without creating a climate of trust, perhaps you cannot win the hearts of people. You have to create conditions where people have full trust in you. Only then your interpersonal behavior becomes superb, very superior. Also, a successful leader, or I will say a successful manager who is also a good leader, must also have self knowledge. Self knowledge. Therefore, when we are discussing these leadership styles, including the charismatic one, in which we have not discussed in great details, but as a charismatic leader, when we say the person has some kind of a emotional involvement with their subordinates, okay, and people start having so much trust in the manager that they follow the person with all kind of a trust, because he is a very caring manager, perhaps caring leader, perhaps. All these lead us to the understanding that what could be the leadership strategies, and here we are discussing that leader is someone. Finally, we are trying to look at what look at whatever we have discussed in the past 2 or 3 hours perhaps about leadership at the place of work, that a leader is someone who is able to develop and communicate a vision which gives meaning to the work of others, which gives meaning to the work of others. Now, very close to the understanding of leadership style is our understanding of power, authority and leadership. In fact, many of you might think that if we are talking about the issue of authority and power, this is synonymous to leadership. In fact, we have discussed the roles earlier in our course, and leadership role, when a person is playing the different types of leadership roles, tied to that are some kind of a authority, particularly in a formal role that a person is playing. And here what we are trying to understand is that we make a distinction between power and authority. Power, as we are understanding that power is informal authority, and authority, when we use the word authority, that is the legitimate authority that is given to him as part of the role that the person is playing. So, that distinction we have to understand when we are trying to look at the whole process of leadership. As we have seen, leadership is assigned to you at the place of work. Leadership is your personal trait. Leadership is there in your analysis of followers, and the leadership is the overall work situation, and we are looking at the work performance, but very closely tied to when we are talking about a formal situation, the legitimate authority, the issue of legitimate authority. So, here I make a distinction to make you understand that the understanding of leadership is not complete unless we have understood a distinction between power, authority and leadership. Now, power, as we are saying, is an ability to get an individual or group to do something or to change it in some way. Ability to manipulate, capability to influence. We are trying to understand the power, and many a times in our day to day conversation, often we forget to make a distinction between power and authority. Often we use these two very much interchangeably, because in some positions of authority you also exercise some power. Now, when we call it authority, then we mean the legitimate authority, and that which could be a source of power organized in nature of that role that you are trying to practice at that moment. Authority also talks about that you have right to manipulate others. And closely tied to the concept of power, authority and leadership is the process of influence, which refers to the broader scope of the process, and we call influence as broader in scope than power, and which involves the ability to alter attitudes, behavior priorities and activities of others, because influence will take some time. It is not that influence is just in one particular action, it goes on and on and on. But in terms of your power, you have perhaps acted in a particular moment and you have shown your power. Nevertheless, influence is an important factor, underlying factor in that whole process of authority and leadership. Now, when we are talking about power, one could have physical power, one could have resource power, one could have position power, one could have expert power, or one could have personal power. And in fact, a person is trying to use all that in a formal situation. And in fact, we could have used the word power and authority. So, here there is a model proposed by the same author, that the physical power, resource power, position power, expert power and the personal power, they influence different type of behavior in organization. Say the physical power is using force, then resource and position power is using exchange, rules, regulations. Expert power and personal power are using persuasion. It may not be written anywhere in the company charter, but the personal power, which we can say which leads to the leadership style of the charismatic type, persuasion is the model of influence. So, we are trying to discuss the models of influence in terms of different types of power people exercise in an organization, which are of course related to the authority and leadership in an organization. I am sure you have many examples also in your mind, but when we formally look at these situations, we find that managers also need to understand and exercise their power very judiciously. Also, another type of power that we talk about in a formal organization is the reward power. The role that you are playing, what is the reward power that is attributed or which is embedded into that particular role. And this includes the ability to reward others, power could also be coercive, which creates fear in the subordinates. But power could be legitimate, which is the legitimate authority given to you with that role, and it is recommended. So, as a leader, when you are trying to act upon in a formal situation, you have to use your authority, which is legitimate, given to you because you have been given that particular role, or you can say that position, that post, okay, and with all positions, all posts, all roles, some kind of authority is given to you. That is the legitimate authority which is given to you, and you are supposed to exercise that very judiciously. Okay. But unfortunately, what happens, the other variants that we have discussed, the coercive power, also the reward power, whether you are using it judiciously or no, that's the question. Okay. But you are not really supposed to use the coercive power, I mean that freely. In fact, that should not be used at all. In addition to this, there is a referent power which we call as the personal characteristic, which is included in the personal characteristic, we can say, the referent power. You have expert power, and one may be very low at a very lower level in the hierarchy of an organization. You understand the hierarchy of an organization, that when you have an organization chart, there is a general manager, there are assistant general managers, there are foremen, there are supervisors. So, that's the way the organization chart we discuss. We have discussed that earlier also. So, in that, when a person is down very low in the level of that organization chart, but the person may still have some kind of a authority, which is the expertise and knowledge. A person very low in his power, but low level in the hierarchy, but high in the power of knowledge and expertise, will also command some authority. So, you as a very young manager, when you join an organization, but you are joining with some command of knowledge, you will exercise some authority and power in your organization. So, you need not become the top boss, but your knowledge takes you to the higher level, because you have that authority of expertise. So, that becomes another source of power that the person might have, and that is why many a times if the organization is in crisis, and we will remember the lower level people or some experts from some departments, and we will call them, because we know that that is the person who is an authority in this subject. Okay. One need not be the general manager of a company or the managing director of a company, but there are experts in every organization, and they need not be at the very top level. They may be very young, enthusiastic, intelligent experts like you people, and then you are in demand because of that authority that is there with you. Okay. So, the question is not that the leadership, one commands authority and leadership only when one goes to the top. One could also command authority and leadership by virtue of one's knowledge and expertise. So, the power and influence relationship, when we understand, that has number of characteristics. This is based on the orders of priority, dominance, dependency relationship, hierarchy and status, and some of these I have already discussed during my earlier discussion. So, we have dealt with all these 4 aspects in our discussion. Further, we have friendship, we have dislike, and also the organizational features. Organizational features, we have, if you would recollect, many a times we have talked about the type of industry, the type of work demand, the type of work flow, the type of authority structure, the type of technology. We have talked about organizational features earlier, also with reference to many other topics, including the organizational values, organizational mission, organizational vision. So, when we talk about organizational features, these include a host of all these variables which relate to the characteristics of an organization, and these also influence the power and influence relationships. So, when power is used, this is used by increasing the power base, and we make use of power by using control areas of uncertainty, satisfy strategic contingencies, create dependencies, and provide resources. See, uncertainty is an important aspect of any situation where we are trying to manage, because if you expect that you have the algorithms for all the situations, perhaps very few situations while you are managing a social system, managing an organization. Uncertainty is inevitable in your decision making situations. So, that is a great challenge for you. And so, these strategic contingencies which relate to uncertainty, that there are many contingent situations which are coming and which create challenge for you, and therefore, creating some dependencies related to those contingencies and uncertainties, and we have to optimize also the resources. So, providing resources for achieving results, and that is the way our power dynamics are used in an organization. So, as a manager, you have to think and you have to practice some of these issues. Do not just take that you have got the position of power and authority, and so you can use your power the way you like. You have to be very, very careful, very, very judicious in using your power and authority as part of your managerial leadership style. And of course, many authors have given that there are tactics for using power. You can build coalitions, you can expand networks, you can control decision premises, you can exchange legitimacy and expertise, you can make preferences explicit, but keep power implicit. Many managers have used some of these tactics for making use of their power in a influence situation. You need not use all the tactics, but some of these sometimes might help you in developing the style of achieving results. But remember, you have always to analyze the leadership situation, you have to analyze your followers, you have to analyze the task at hand, and then decide that do we really need any kind of a strategy or any kind of a expansion of network. Do you really need any kind of a exchange and expertise in this situation. Okay. And you can see that in developing all these situations, participative management is of great help. Also in the literature, see, because we are also talking about organizational politics at some times when we are discussing the issue of leadership, authority and influence. there is an organizational politics also simultaneously going on, because that is the part of human nature. So, people also play some of the political games, and some of these which are listed by some authors are insurgency games, sponsorship games, empire building games, expertise games, rival camp games, strategic candidate games, young Turk Jenny. These are some of the games. If you would recollect, we had talked about transactional analysis in one of our earlier lectures, and there we were talking about the different types of transactions and the games that we play and which managers play at the place of work. Okay. These could be taken as some of the games people play at the place of work, okay, and most of them may be a very designed kind of a game, okay, but that we have to see that what games we have to play and how judicious and ethical are we in playing these games. Then we come to the pattern of influence. The patterns of influence could be understood as the reasons, coalitions, assertiveness, sanction, friendliness, bargaining, and higher authority. Some of the patterns of influence we have listed here. See, in all these topics we can go on and on, because human behavior and social system both are so complex that and ever since humanity is there, we have been debating on various issues of how to make a very effective work performance situation. So, we have lot of knowledge packed into this. So, we can go on and on discussing many of these issues. Here I am giving you some idea about how could you use effectively your leadership style, how could you influence, what is the distinction between power, authority, and how do you become one of the best managers. Okay. But much also depends on your practice of some of these issues, and lot many things have been written by authors, and based on experience, based on experimentation, based on the various publications, and also the greater the power, greater the variety of strategies. Greater the power, greater the variety of strategies. And finally, we come to the patterns of influence in terms of that influence, when it works, that has to be understood which subordinates a range of strategies. See, we have talked about leadership, and we have talked about that followers are the important components of understanding of the overall leadership situation. Therefore, subordinates range of strategies with superiors mostly by reason, and when we combine the two, we find that the influence process is working. Now, with all these discussion, we have had about more than 2 hours, in fact about 3 hours discussion on what leadership is all about, how this human characteristic influences the social system, and manager at the place of work has to be also a great leader in order to become a very good manager. And in that he has to understand the psyche of the subordinates, psyche of the followers. He has to achieve the task performance, because if we are talking about manager in a formal system, in a work organization, because here our reference has been mainly to managers at the place of work. We have not dealt with the leaders, the religious leaders and the other social leaders and social activists. We have not dealt with that group of leadership. We have dealt with basically the work organization, and managers are the leaders in a work organization. So, the issues that we have picked up relate to the social influence process that works as part of the authority, power, authority and leadership in organizations, and how could we impart leadership to our young managers in order to become very effective leaders. With this, we have completed our discussion on motivation, group behavior, the roles people play, the transactional analysis, different styles of leadership and its relationship with the influence and the authority process. Whatever I have discussed, this is not the end. Many things have been written. There are so many new publications are coming up, and every day, particularly because India is going global, even in India we have been doing lot of studies which relate to these issues. So, maybe sometimes in some other chapters also these references will come, and we might sort of pick up and pick and choose from whatever we have discussed in some of these lectures. Okay.